Hello there, my fellow music lovers, and thanks so much for stopping by this channel and for checking out this video. In this one, I'm going to be talking about 50th anniversaries. Are you ready for 50? Because we're going to start hearing a lot about 50th anniversaries for the next decade or two as we start heading into the 70s. Now, we've already talked about some 50ths, because let's face it, whenever we're looking back 50 years, we've been looking back to, the 60s, the early to mid 60s. There's been some 50ths that we've already had with the Rolling Stones and the Beatles and the Who. We've had some Beatles reissues that have come out lately. The Stones have put some albums out. The Kinks have even had some reissues. But now we're starting to really head into the thick of it. 50 years ago, this year is 1969. And we're starting to get into the beginnings of the classic rock era, especially once we start getting into like 1970, 71, 72, 73. We're talking about bands that defined classic rock, defined hard rock, and soft rock, and prog rock, and heavy metal, and all the different genres that we've come to know and that we've come to love. We're getting their feet wet here in 69, getting into the 70s. There's lots of density, lots of artists getting started, lots of albums coming out. And of course, there's going to be a lot of 50th anniversary tours that we're going to start seeing more of. There's going to be lots of box sets and these reissues, these super deluxe versions of albums that came out in the 70s and beyond. And just get ready for it. I'm just trying to prep you for it. And it's not all that bad. It's a way to celebrate, I think, some of the best music that's ever been recorded. And it's music that we still love. I mean, the fans that were around 50 years ago, they've had kids, maybe even grandkids, and they are falling in love with this. This is timeless music. And, in this video, I want to take a look back 50 years ago to 1969 and take a look at some of the top albums, some of the best albums that came out in that year. I should also mention, too, that I will be celebrating 50 years this year. If you can believe that, I really can. I can't believe that I'm going to be 50 this summer. I was born the same week as Woodstock. And it just doesn't add up for me. I still feel like I'm in my 30s. And I try not to think about it a whole lot, So just thought I'd throw that out there. But let's get into these albums that came out in 1969. One thing I noticed was that there was so much great music coming out. Lots of artists, putting out their debut albums. And also lots of genres kind of getting their start. You can really start to hear the beginnings of hard rock and prog rock and all these other types of genres that were going to be well defined as we started heading into the 70s. Of course, one of the biggest albums to come out in 1969 is the debut album from Led Zeppelin. I mean, this is a game changer, folks. This album here helped to really solidify and define the hard rock genre. I mean, this album was just amazing from start to finish. Yeah, some of it was lifted from the old blues greats from the 40s and 50s, but, Zeppelin turned it into their own thing. I mean, you would never mistake Muddy Waters for Led Zeppelin. I mean, they were two completely different things. And then, of course, Zeppelin put out their second album in 1969 as well, Zeppelin 2. I mean, how badass is that? Zeppelin 1 and 2 in the same year. Zeppelin 2, in my opinion, their best album, or at least one of the top couple. I mean, it's an amazingly tight album, with a whole lot of love, Ramble On, Heartbreaker, Living, Loving, Made, all those songs. Great stuff there. And also 1969 was a big year for Neil Young. It was the first year that he put out a solo album, and then he formed Crazy Horse, and they put out their debut album, Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere, as well in 1969. You may recall Cinnamon Girl and Down by the River. Those two songs were on that debut album. And this was the beginning of Neil Young and Crazy Horse, a band that would rule in the 70s. So already we've got Led Zeppelin and Neil Young and Crazy Horse kind of lifting off. And we know where they go. This is just the beginning for those two guys. And 1969 also saw the end of a band the band Cream. Now, they actually ended in 1968, but they put out their final album in 1969 called Goodbye, which was actually a mixture of some live material and some new studio stuff. And one of my favorite songs from the studio side of the album was this track called Badge, which is kind of interesting how it got its name. George Harrison had written the word bridge on the lyric sheet, and Eric Clapton thought it said badge, and so that actually became the name of the song. That band ended, and then Eric Clapton quickly formed a new band called Blind Faith, which included Ginger Baker and also Steve Winwood from the Spencer Davis Group. So from one supergroup to another one. And Blind Faith only put out one album, and it was a really good album too. I mean, a lot of people liked it, and they were expected to keep on going and making more albums, but Eric Clapton decided that he wanted to do something else. He was kind of on a creative high, Clapton, and he basically wanted to go play with some other people and do some other things. He hadn't even put out his own solo album yet. Later on, Clapton felt a little bad about how things ended abruptly with Blind Faith, and not too long ago, maybe it's been about 10 years or so now, he got together with Steve Winwood and they went on tour and they played a lot of the Blind Faith stuff, and that was really, really good. If you ever get a chance to check out that DVD Blu-ray that they put out, really, really solid performance from those guys. And also Clapton was able to reunite with Cream before Jack Bruce passed away. They did a series of shows that was also captured and released on Blu-ray. Check that stuff out if you want to revisit those two periods for Eric Clapton. Really, really good stuff there. Also, just so you know, I've put together a playlist. I pulled a bunch of songs from these great albums and threw them into a playlist. You can check out the link in the description below. Now, some more great albums that came out in 1969. The debut from Joe Cocker, With a Little Help from My Friends. You may recall his tune Feelin' Alright. That came out from this album. And also the debut of Chicago, when they were known as the Chicago Transit Authority. What a great album this was. You had like, Does Anybody Really Know What Time It Is? Beginnings, Questions 67 and 68. I remember my father had this album, and when I finally reached a point where I was listening to albums, I would throw on the vinyl and I would listen to this. And I have to believe that this helped shape my musical palette, because I never became a big fan of Chicago, but because it was filled with so much fusion and these long songs, a lot of jamming, I'd have to think that this helped pave the way for, let's say, Queen, or for the Prog stuff that I would get into. I'm always fascinated with how one thing leads to another, and so I never really thought about it until now. How this album may have influenced me. And it's a really good album. You should check it out if you're into jazz rock, for sure. Also, 1969 saw the release of Bob Seger's debut album when he was known as the Bob Seger System. And we get Ramblin' Gamblin' Man came out of that album. We also get The Who. They released their fourth album, Tommy, which was just this huge album, double album concept by Pete Townsend, and of course went on to spawn a movie, and it's generally regarded as, you know, one of the best Who albums, even though they still had a lot more great stuff yet to come. Also, Crosby, Stills, and Nash made their debut in 1969 with their first album. You may recall, you know, songs like Sweet Judy Blue Eyes was on that album, Marrakesh Express. Crosby, Stills, and Nash, like Cream, was a supergroup made up of members of the Hollies and the Byrds and Buffalo Springfield. And for their next album, I believe, they would bring in Neil Young, who was, you know, doing solo albums. He was doing stuff with Crazy Horse, and then he'd go off and do some stuff with Crosby, Stills, and Nash. I mean, as I said before, Neil was just getting started. Also, we get the debut of Elton John. He put out his first album called Empty Sky. That came out in 69, although it didn't come out in the States until 1975. And of course, Elton John's first stateside album to really blow up was the one that came after this, which had like Your Song on it and everything. But Skyline Pigeon was the first real song, first notable song from Elton John that he still kind of plays every so often. And that was on his first album. And of course, we all know what happened to Elton John. You know, he's had such a career that there's going to be a film, a biopic released about him this summer. I think it comes out in May, called Rocket Man. So, of course, you know, he's had a tremendous career, and he's actually on a farewell tour now. So he's kind of wrapping things up, or so he says. We also saw the debut album from Rod Stewart in 1969. You know, he as well, of course, had a tremendous career. He had already played with Jeff Beck in the Jeff Beck group, and he was doing some stuff with the Small Faces around this time, which became Faces with Ron Wood. But he put out his first solo album called An Old Raincoat Won't Ever Let You Down, which was, I think, known as the Rod Stewart album here in the States. And then, of course, there was the debut album from Santana, which came out in '69 as well. This was a tremendous album. Kind of like the Chicago album, this was a fusion album, and an album that my father as well owned. I remember he used to play not only Evil Ways, but he was really big into this song called Jingo, and that's just a tremendous song. The whole album is great. Persuasion, Soul Sacrifice, top to bottom, great debut. Santana was bolstered by their performance at Woodstock, and of course they went on to spawn Greg Raleigh and Neil Schon, who went on to form Journey. And you can definitely tell, like I said, going over this list, you can hear all these tremendous artists that are just getting their start and what they wound up doing throughout the 70s and even into the 80s, and whether they're still around now. It's just amazing. I mean, Carlos is still around. He's still playing very, very well. They're going to go back to Woodstock and play that. I'm going to get into that in just a little bit, but yeah, I actually saw Santana a few years back, and that was a tremendous show. And they actually got back together with Neil Schon and Greg Raleigh and some of the other guys from the original band. And that was another, I think it was called Santana 4, was the album that they put out. They put out a DVD. Check it out if you like that real, you know, original lineup era fusion. Tremendous, tremendous stuff there. Another album to come out in '69 that I really liked was the self-titled second album from the band. I'm talking about the one with Robbie Robertson and Levon Helm and Rick Danko and those guys. Very unique music here. I mean, for a band that came from Canada, they sounded like they came out of the swamps of the southern United States, you know, just very backwoodsy kind of music, very organic. Just loved their sound. The band originally were the backing band for Bob Dylan back in the mid-'60s, and then eventually they would go on to form their own band, and they decided to just call themselves the band because that's what everybody called them. Now, of course, 1969 also saw the release of one of the biggest and best albums ever, Abbey Road by the Beatles. You want to talk about an influential album? This album was just amazing, you know, Come Together. You had Something by George Harrison, one of his best songs, the whole Abbey Road medley. This album really sparked a lot of people to pick up an instrument, to want to become a singer, to want to get into music. These are the kinds of albums, not just this one, but all these albums that I've been talking about, these are the kinds of albums that got people off their ass, that inspired people. And we start to see the effects of this as we get into the 70s, bands coming up who were inspired by the Beatles, who wanted to do what they're doing because they saw the Stones, or they saw the Kinks, or they heard the Beach Boys. That wave will be coming in soon. But this Beatles album was really their last album. This was the last sessions that the Beatles had as a group. The album that came after this, Let It Be, it came out in 1970, but they recorded that album before Abbey Road. So technically, this really is their last album. The last song is The End. So it's a very fitting way to kind of end the album. And then we had the Rolling Stones, who were putting out one of their best albums ever in 1969, Let It Bleed. I remember my father had this album too. He used to play it all the time. I used to listen to it, just loved it. It was like an American roots kind of an album. Kind of reminds me of like when U2 with the Joshua Tree and Rattle and Hum, they kind of tied into like American roots music, and you can hear it like in the songs like Desire and Where the Streets Have No Name and Still Haven't Found What I'm Looking For. Kind of got into that whole gospel kind of thing. And that's what the Stones were doing in '69. They were tying into gospel music and country, and this was shaping their sound in '69. And we get stuff like Gimme Shelter, You Can't Always Get What You Want, and Monkey Man. You know, just an amazing album. Really, really good stuff here. And then we get into the beginnings of progressive rock. We get the debut album from Robert Fripp and Company, otherwise known as King Crimson. The first album called In the Court of the Crimson King. And I'll never forget the first time that I heard 21st Century Schizoid Man. Now, my father didn't own this album. He probably wouldn't have gone anywhere near this stuff. I had to pick this stuff up on my own. But I remember I heard 21st Century Schizoid Man, and it just completely blew me away. I think based on the stuff that I had already been listening to, like the Chicago and the Beatles and the band and the Stones and some of the stuff that I've been talking about, it kind of prepped me for listening to Crimson. Because when that came out, not when it came out, because I didn't hear it when it came out, but when I first heard Schizoid Man, it completely blew me away, and I could just feel myself getting sucked into other bands like Yes and Genesis and ELP. It definitely made it easier for me to get into those bands. And the debut album from Crimson was just amazing. As a matter of fact, John Anderson of Yes, when I interviewed him, he talked about it, how Fripp and Company freaked him out because Yes was just getting started. They also released their debut album in 1969. And when John Anderson heard 21st Century Schizoid Man and heard, Crimson, it really made him and the rest of the band feel like they needed to up their game. The drummer in Yes, Bill Bruford, actually went on to join Crimson. So you know that he was looking at the band, taking notes, and when he felt like he had already done enough in Yes, he jumped ship and went to join Crimson for a few albums. And also, one of the things that I love about the debut album from Crimson is the artwork. It's such iconic artwork. Little trivia, unfortunately, the guy who did that artwork, he passed away. He died of a heart attack just a few months after this album came out. So that's pretty sad. But as I had mentioned, the debut album from Yes came out in 1969, and it was a pretty good album, actually. You can definitely hear that the band had chops, and that they were more than just your simple, 4/4 time band. They definitely had more going on. They seemed to have a jazzy kind of underbelly, and they had these harmonies going on, like the Fifth Dimension and the Beatles and the Beach Boys kind of thing going on. As a matter of fact, they covered every little thing from the Beatles on their debut album, and it was a very adventurous cover, very, very good cover. So yeah, a very solid debut album from Yes, and 1969 also saw the debut album from another prog rock giant to be, Genesis. They put out their first album called From Genesis to Revelation, and this was a very different album than what they would be known for. They didn't have Phil Collins yet, they didn't have Steve Hackett, and the band sounded more like the Bee Gees than like Crimson or like Yes or any of those other types of bands. The songs were very simple, kind of British pop songs, and it really wasn't until we started getting to the second album, Trespass, and then of course Nursery Crime, when they got Collins, that things really started to take shape. But Genesis, actually, their first album, not a lot of people bought it because they thought it was a religious album based on the name. And so it just kind of got overlooked. But there are some nice pieces on that album, actually. And of course, another big prog rock giant was Jethro Tull, although they hadn't gotten to that point yet. Their second album, Stand Up, came out in 1969, and this is when they were more of a blues rock kind of band. And this is actually my favorite Jethro Tull album. It's got some really good stuff on it, like Back to the Family, New Day Yesterday, Bore, Nothing Is Easy, Really good stuff on this album. Another really cool album to come out in '69 was Frank Zappa's Hot Rats, which was technically his second solo album. Lumpy Gravy was the first one that came out the year before. And this was also the year that Frank Zappa disbanded the Mothers of Invention, probably due to financial reasons, but there may have been some other things. I mean, let's face it, Zappa really is not, I don't think, destined to be a member of a band. It seems like he likes to do a lot of things himself. I remember reading one of the things he didn't like about being in a band was that you had to put up with other people's shortcomings, like maybe they were drinking too much or on drugs, or they weren't performing very well. And maybe this is why Frank Zappa would often make albums like by himself. Like he was perfectly capable of going into the studio, playing all the instruments and doing everything that he needed. And he started to use that more and more as he got into his career. He would make albums by himself. He was quite the studio wizard as the technology caught up with what he wanted to actually do. But Hot Rats is a really great album. It's one of the albums that you might like if you're not a fan of Frank Zappa, because I know a lot of people tend to not like the way he sings and all that stuff, but really most of this album is an instrumental. One of the great songs from this album is Peaches and Regalia, which is like a classic Frank Zappa piece, just a great instrumental. And so if you're not a fan of Frank, maybe you'll like that. I encourage you to go check it out. And also '69 saw the release of Pink Floyd's fourth album, Ummagumma, which like Cream's Goodbye album, which was released this year, also featured a mixture of live material and new songs. And the new side of the album actually featured solo works. And the band members looking back on the album now think that it was a disaster and don't really look too fondly on it. But it does feature a lot of their, classic psychedelic stuff. And interestingly enough, Nick Mason, the drummer from Pink Floyd, has put together a band called Saucer Full of Secrets. And they're going to be hitting the road soon. And unlike a lot of other Pink Floyd tribute bands, his band's going to be focusing on material from like the pre-Animals era. So they're going to be playing stuff like this, like Saucer Full of Secrets and Careful With That Axe and that kind of stuff. So if you're a fan of the psychedelic Floyd, then you're going to want to check out Nick Mason's band that's going to be hitting the road soon, playing in the States. And 1969 also saw the debut album of the Allman Brothers Band. And this is an album that spawned like Whipping Post and Dreams and Trouble No More. And it's just amazing, going through all these artists that I've been talking about. These are bands that are going to redefine the next 20 years or so of classic rock. And they're just getting going here in '69. And finally, I didn't know this, but Kool and the Gang put out their debut album in 1969. I always associated them as like a late 70s, 80s band. Especially the 80s. That's when they had a lot of their hits. But Kool and the Gang, yeah, they are 50 years old this year. And so that's a look at some of the great albums that came out 50 years ago, 1969. And also just want to run through some tours, because in addition to, albums having an anniversary, a lot of these artists are going out on tour. And so what I'm seeing is that a lot of bands are celebrating. Usually it's like a year before their debut album came out, because they're celebrating or acknowledging when they first got together. So that's usually about a year or two before their first album came out. And so we've got some anniversary tours happening in 2019. One of them is going to be Emerson, Lake and Palmer is going to be recognized with an anniversary show. Carl Palmer has mentioned that he has a A-list group of people getting together to give tribute to Emerson, Lake and Palmer. I don't know who that's going to be, where it's going to be, if it's just one show, multiple shows, what's going to happen, but I'm sure we'll be getting some details on that soon. Also, we've got King Crimson, who I mentioned earlier. They are on tour for their 50th. Unfortunately, not much in the way of U.S. dates. They've only got like 3 of them, Hopefully they will add some more. I don't know. Aerosmith, they are celebrating 50 years this year with a Vegas residency. Also, another band celebrating 50 years is Dr. Hook. They're going on a 50th anniversary tour this year and next. And thanks to Melissa Cross, who is a subscriber of this channel. She's the one that sent me a message about Dr. Hook. So thank you very, very much, Melissa. And what's sad is that the guy with the eye patch, Ray Sawyer, he just passed away like about a week ago. I couldn't even include him in my 2018 wrap-up video because he passed away like the next day. He had been sick for quite some time. And so it's sad to see him go. The band is being led now by Dennis. I can't pronounce his last name. But he's been the one flying the Dr. Hook flag for the past number of years. And so he's basically taking the band out on a tour. I haven't seen any U.S. dates. They're all elsewhere. So if you're a fan of Dr. Hook, you may want to go check them out. Also, Jethro Tull is doing a 50th anniversary tour this year, although it's not really Jethro Tull the way we've known and loved. Ian Anderson, the lead singer, will even tell you that. He's just calling it Jethro Tull because that's all he's going to be playing. He usually goes out and plays a mixture of solo stuff and Jethro Tull, but this is just going to be Tull from what I understand, so that's why he's calling it that. And I think by now most fans come to realize, you know, what they're getting when they go see Tull. We've also got Yes, still on their 50th anniversary tour. They're going to be hitting Japan this year. And of course, there's the offshoot Anderson, Rabin, Wakeman, or Yes, or whatever you want to call them. They're supposed to be resuming their tour of the U.S. soon, although I have not heard any dates. And a few other bands that are going to be celebrating 50 years this year with anniversary tours is going to be Little Feat, also ZZ Top and Judas Priest. So look out for them. And last but not least, Woodstock turns 50 this year. And there's going to be 2 events that are going to happen to celebrate Woodstock. There's going to be one held at Bethel Woods, which is the original site. And then there's going to be one, the official event is going to be done up by Michael Lang, who was the originator of Woodstock back in 1969. He wanted to hold it at Bethel Woods, but he didn't feel like the venue could hold the kind of show that he wants to do. So he's going to have another event that's going to happen at some other place that hasn't been announced. We don't know who's going to be playing where, and so those details will be coming soon. But look for 2 Woodstock events coming this summer. All right, so there you go. There's a look at some of the best albums that came out 50 years ago this year. And how many of them do you own? Do you love? Drop it in the comments below and let me know. Are you going to go see any of these 50th anniversary tours this year? Let me know that too. And also don't forget to check out the playlist that I threw together that's got songs from all these great albums. Give this video a thumbs up if you like it. Hit that subscribe button too. And I will see you soon in another video.